A brand new series on the Old Testament character that we know as Joseph. Okay, and we're actually going to start this series of messages when Joseph was 17 years old. Okay, you need to keep that in mind. And so I thought, just for kicks, it would be fun for you, more fun for you than for me, to show you a picture of me when I was 17 years old. Okay, go ahead and throw it up there. There you go. I know, it's funny, right? You got to remember, this was 50 years ago, okay? And I've said it more than once. The 70s is the decade of great music and horrible fashion, okay? I am so thankful those butterfly bow ties have not reappeared on the scene. So thank you. You can get rid of that now. Thank you. Okay. But here's what I want you to do. I want you to think back to when you were 17, when you were a goofy 17-year-old, okay? Some of you can't think back that far. I understand. What did you think your life was going to be like when you were 17? When you were looking ahead at the rest of your life, what did you envision? How did you see your life working out? I don't know about you, but almost nothing about my life has turned out like I thought it would when I was that 17-year-old kid, okay? Because when that photo was taken, I was dating a girl that I never, ever saw again after I graduated high school. Never saw her again. At 17 years old, I was planning on being an architect. At 17 years old, the closest friends that I had back then, I've seen 2 of them in the last 5 years. And I never, in my wildest dreams at 17 years old, ever think that I'd end up being a pastor. That never crossed my mind. I never considered the fact that I would end up somewhere in Middle Tennessee. I'd never even heard of Franklin, Tennessee. And I certainly had never heard of Thompson Station, Tennessee. I never expected or planned on any of the painful setbacks or the twists and turns that I have experienced in my life. What about you? Has your life been a straight line from 17 to today, with no surprises whatsoever, no detours from your main path, no setbacks of any kind? For how many of you, your life has turned out to be exactly what you thought it would be? Or does your life, as you look back, look more like this? Put the next slide up there. There you go. Y'all remember Family Circus? That cartoon, and the route that Billy would often take from here to there. I used to love getting the Sunday comics and opening up and looking at Family Circus, and actually, I would actually take the time to read each of those little stops along the way that Billy took. You can see all the little squiggly lines, right? Maybe this is a better definition of what your life looks like when you look back. We all have those unplanned, unexpected plot twists that have happened in our life story. Those chapters in your life story that you didn't write, you certainly would not have wanted to write them, but they seem to have been written for you by some outside force and then inserted into your life without your say-so. They just happened. And that's what we're going to be taking a look at through this entire series on the life of Joseph. So let me go ahead and acknowledge on the front end right here that I think some of you perhaps may right now be living through some of those unexpected twists and turns. Maybe you are in the middle right now of a setback. You certainly weren't counting on that health scare. You didn't expect to lose that job. You didn't think that you'd be living alone still at this age that you are. You didn't think that depression was going to be as big a part of your life as it has turned out to be. Maybe you just feel lost spiritually, and it's not where you thought you would be. Well, we're going to look at these unexpected setbacks, these detours in Joseph's life from a biblical perspective, so that we can see maybe how God wants us to deal with them when they happen to us. We're going to look at Joseph's life and see how God helped him handle those setbacks, those life course alterations, if you will. And so what I want to do is start by giving each of us a working definition that will serve as the framework for this series, okay? This is our working definition of what a setback is, all right? It is a change in our plans that God will often use to develop our character and our experiences so that we can arrive at a better destination than we intended if we allow God to do that in our life, okay? That's what we're going to be working with as we go through this series. So let's go to Joseph, and his story begins in the book of Genesis, chapter 37, and it goes all the way through chapter 50 of the book of Genesis. That's a lot of space, folks, devoted to one character in the Old Testament, isn't it? I don't know if you ever noticed this before or not, or paid attention, but Joseph has had more written about his life in the Old Testament than any other character except for Moses. More than Abraham, more than Noah, more than Adam and Eve. And maybe that's because God wants us to learn how to deal with life and all of its setbacks when those things don't go as planned. And that's why he devoted so much space to the life story of Joseph. So in chapter 37 of Genesis, we pick up his story and we take a look at the first major setback that he experienced in his life. The first twist and turn, to borrow a VBS phrase, that he has in his life. Genesis chapter 37, verse 2. This is the account of Jacob and his family. When Joseph was 17 years old, see, there it is, 17 years old, he often tended his father's flocks. He worked for his half-brothers, the sons of his father's wives, Bilhah and Zilpah. So the first thing that you notice when you take a look at the story of Joseph is this is a messy family, all right? Anybody identify with a messy family? Joseph's father, Jacob, had 12 sons with 4 different wives. And 2 of those wives were sisters. Man, this is as messed up as anything you can see on TV nowadays, okay? I'm just saying. This is one twisted, messed up family, and nobody in this family gets along, okay? All right, verse 2 continues. So Joseph, he worked for his half-brothers, the sons of his father's wives, Bilhah and Zilpah, but Joseph reported to his father some of the bad things his brothers were doing. So the next thing that we learn about Joseph is that he's a tattletale. Anybody have a younger brother or younger sister when you were growing up who was always telling on you? Okay, yeah, you understand. You can relate now to Joseph's brothers, okay? Having a tattletale for a brother or sister is bad enough, but it gets worse than that, all right? Verse 3, Jacob loved Joseph more than any of his other children because Joseph had been born to him in his old age. So one day, Jacob had a special gift made for Joseph, a beautiful robe. So not only is he a tattletale, but all the other older brothers know that Joseph is also his father's favorite and is a spoiled brat, okay? So how did they know that? Because all those other brothers had to wear each other's hand-me-downs, or they had to wear clothes that were bought at Goodwill, right? While Joseph was given clothes like Gucci, okay? That's the comparison here, all right? And I know you all have this image in your mind of Joseph in the amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat in your picture, or Dolly Parton's coat of many colors, right? That's what you see in your head when you're thinking Joseph in this robe. And his coat may have been multicolored. It may not have been, because the descriptive words that are used in the Old Testament here in the original language just mean ornate. And I read somewhere in preparing that it said that this word signifies needlework that extends to the cuffs and the ankles. And I'll say something about that in a minute. Basically, what everybody else was wearing was a big rectangular piece of cloth with a hole cut in the middle of it. You'd pull it over your head, and you basically got a poncho, right? And then you can wrap the sides of that thing around to keep it closed, and then take a sash and tie it up. That's what men wore back in Joseph's day. Joseph, on the other hand, was given a handmade garment that actually had sleeves and legs that extended all the way to the cuffs and the ankles. This was one fancy piece of clothing, let me tell you. Think Jeff Gordon back in his Rainbow Warrior days, that one-piece NASCAR outfit that he wore. That's what Joseph was basically wearing when everybody else was walking around in a poncho, all right? And so these other brothers, they do not like Joseph at all. And that's not just a guess on my part, okay? It actually says so in verse 4. His brothers hated Joseph because their father loved him more than the rest of them. The more his father loved him, the more the brothers hated him. They couldn't say a kind word to him. And if Joseph had any sense at all, he would have picked up on that, right? He would have known that his brothers didn't care for him at all, and he would have at least found a smart way to navigate through this messy situation with his brothers. He would have figured out ways to at least be kind and pleasant and friendly with his brothers. But he doesn't do that. Joseph, I'm saying all that to say this. Joseph does not start out his life story here in the Old Testament as a perfect example of someone that God can use and bless. That's not the picture of the young man that we have. This is not a guy who never did anything wrong. This is not a guy who always handled every situation perfectly. You don't see that when you read the early part here of Joseph's story. What you actually see is an entitled, prideful, arrogant, boastful 17-year-old, a typical 17-year-old, okay? Any 17-year-olds in here? I'm sorry if what I said describes you in any way, because you are certainly not this, right? Verse 5. One night, Joseph had a dream, and when he told his brothers about it, they hated him even more. Now, why would they hate him more than ever? Because here's what Joseph told them. He said, hey, guys, I had a dream, and in this dream, all of you older brothers were bowing down to me. Can I give you guys some free advice? If you ever dream that you and your brothers and sisters are in this dream, and they are bowing down to you, don't tell them. Don't tell them that. Just keep it to yourself, okay? There are some things that are just better left unsaid. But nope, Joseph went ahead and opened his mouth and said all that. And I mean, he's just so prideful and arrogant. And that's not all. He had a second dream. And in that dream, it's not just his brothers who are bowing down to him, but his parents too. And so he tells them that. And his father Jacob's kind of like, Joseph, you got to tone it down a little bit. You just got to zip your mouth up. Don't tell all that. And all of this sets the stage for this first setback in Joseph's life, all right? So we move ahead in the story, and once again, the brothers are all out doing the work, right? Keeping watch over the sheep, leading them to their grazing land, and watching over them, keeping them safe. And Jacob, once again, sends his spoiled little pride and joy son, Joseph, the tattletale brother, to check on the older brothers. And so he heads out, and in verse 17 of Genesis 37, this is what the Bible says. So Joseph followed his brothers to Dothan and found them there. Now I went and looked at an Old Testament map, and I did a little research, and I found out that Dothan was due north of Hebron, where they lived, 62 miles. All right, 62. It's like going from here up I-65 to the Kentucky state line. That's 62 miles. Verse 18. When Joseph's brothers saw him coming, they recognized him in the distance. Now, how do you suppose they recognized him? Yeah, the coat. And as he approached, they made plans to kill him. They're going to kill their own brother, for goodness sake. But the oldest brother, Reuben, says, guys, maybe we better not kill him. See that cistern over there? Let's just toss him down into that. And if he dies while he's in there, well, that's on him. At least we didn't do it. okay? At least we can go home and tell our dad, well, we didn't kill him. So that's what they did. Verse 23, when Joseph arrived, his brothers ripped off the beautiful robe he was wearing, the robe that they all hated so much, right? The robe that represented this spoiled, rotten, arrogant little brother of theirs. Then they grabbed him and threw him into the cistern, basically half naked, undergarments only is what he's wearing. Now the cistern was empty, so was there no water in it, which meant that he didn't land with a soft splash, he landed with a hard thud. And he either landed on hard ground or rocks or something, so I can imagine he's hurting down there. He may even be bleeding for all I know. And just like that, Joseph's life takes this unexpected turn. His life is in the pits, and he's hit rock bottom. Those are two dad jokes, by the way, okay? Any of you feel like that? You've hit rock bottom? Your life is in the pits? You can relate to Joseph, okay? But look, what happens next? What do you think happens next? The brothers, they take a lunch break. Joseph's screaming or moaning or something, who knows what, in the bottom of this well, and they're sitting around looking at one another eating cheese and crackers, okay? And so Judah, at this point in the story, one of the brothers says, guys, what are we doing? We can't let him die in there. I mean, we may not like the poor fella, but he is family after all, right? Let's not kill him. Let's get him out. Let's sell him, okay? So that's so much better, right? And I guess that all of this happened along a regular trade route because a band of Midianite slave traders passes by, and they sell their brother Joseph to this caravan for 20 pieces of silver. Now, here's how I know that the Bible was written by God's Spirit and not by some clever individual or group of individuals who decided to make up a story. Because if this were a made-up story, surely they would have made that 20 pieces of silver match the 30 pieces of silver that Judas received for betraying Jesus, right? I mean, that's just common literary sense. But it didn't work out that way. So they splashed some blood on Joseph's robe, and they sent it back to their dad with a little handwritten note that said, "Dear Dad, we found this robe out in the desert. Is this your son's robe?" They didn't even mention him by name. They just said, "Is this your son's robe?" So they're relieved, right, that they've gotten rid of the brother that they all hated. And chapter 37 comes to an end this way. Meanwhile, the Midianite traders arrived in Egypt, where they sold Joseph to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. Potiphar was captain of the palace guard. So that's this first chapter, this first setback in Joseph's life that we're going to look at today. So you talk about an unexpected twist and turn. This was certainly it, right? And as we start this look at the life of Joseph, I just want to take this story to point out at least 4 lessons that I think will help all of us deal with any setback, whatever it might look like in our lives, because those things do happen to us, right? So the first lesson is this. Setbacks can be caused by at least 3 different things. In other words, they don't all happen for the same reason. They don't all come from the same source. Unexpected twists and turns can happen in a bunch of different ways. The first source is this: our own bad choices. You know, a lot of times, folks, the bad stuff that you have to deal with is your own fault, isn't it? It's because you made a stupid decision. You decided to do something that you knew was dumb when you did it, and you knew that God didn't want you to do it when you did it, but you did it anyway. And we've all done that. We're all guilty of it. So that's the first source of these setbacks. The second source is other people's sins, right? You have been, at times in your life, you have been the innocent victim of something stupid or evil or painful that somebody else did. And we're all affected by the sins of other people. And then the third source is this: God's hand, which may very well be directing us to a certain direction or thing. So there are at least 3 sources of these setbacks in our lives: our own bad choices, other people's bad choices, or God's good choice. All right? And truth be told, we have probably seen all three of these kinds of setbacks in our own lives. Now, when we look at Joseph's life in Genesis chapter 37, which of these reasons do you think is the source of his setback? Which do you think? All three. Come on, that's the correct answer. I don't want the correct answer. I want your first inclination. Number two, right? If we jump to the obvious answer, it's number two. It was his brothers who caused his life to take this drastic turn. It was their hatred. It was their jealousy that threw him in the pit. It was their evil heart's intention that sold him into slavery. But can we agree, and yes we can because you've already told me we can, that Joseph was at least partly responsible for this because of how he treated his brothers, right? All of the arrogance, all of the boasting, and he certainly didn't do anything to make himself more likable to his brothers. And then the third one, what we're going to see later is that maybe, just maybe, God had a hand in this. Maybe God was directing Joseph to this place and to this time and to this predicament that he finds himself in. In fact, let's take a sneak peek ahead to the very end of Joseph's story, all right? Genesis chapter 50. Now, bear in mind, at this point, Joseph is not 17 years old anymore. He's now at the end of his life, and he's looking back at the 17-year-old version of himself. And look at what he says in Genesis 50, verse 20. He's talking to his brothers. You intended to harm me, but God intended it all for good. God had a hand in it. He brought me to this position so that I could save the lives of many people. Can you imagine how differently you would view your life in terms of the setbacks that you have experienced, in terms of the disappointments and the letdowns and the painful experiences, if you simply allow for the possibility that God can use and did use all of those bad things in your life for good? Now, why is that so hard for us to do sometimes? Well, I think it's because when our plans don't work out the way we want them to, we immediately go to one of these three options and we start assigning blame. We blame ourselves and we shame ourselves. How many times have you ever said to yourself, you idiot, you dummy, how could you be so stupid? You've said that to yourself. I have too. Or we blame other people and we point fingers and we say it's their fault that I'm in the situation that I'm in. Or we'll get angry and we'll blame God because he could have stopped it, but he didn't. And so we're always blaming for the setbacks in our lives. And here's what I want you to notice. I think this is incredible about Joseph's life. In the light of all of the setbacks that he experienced, never did he ever blame anyone for the things that happened to him. I think that's amazing. He could have, and I think that's a lesson for us, especially the way culture is these days. I don't know how it happened or why it happened, but there was a shift that took place somewhere over the last few decades, and we now relish in this thing called blaming other people. Have you ever noticed how everybody wants to play the victim nowadays? I read about a man named Richard Overton who sued Budweiser for failing to help him attract beautiful women, because he saw commercials and guys drinking Budweiser in those commercials always had beautiful women hanging on them. And so he sued Budweiser and said, it's your fault. I also read about a man named Alan Heckard who once sued Michael Jordan for looking like him and causing him to be mistaken for Michael Jordan time and time again, resulting in, quote, inconvenience and emotional distress. The victim. Listen, you can be victimized, but you don't have to be a victim. In fact, the New Testament teaches us that we are more than conquerors, and that in the end, nothing can separate us from the love of God in Christ Jesus. So, First lesson, those setbacks can come from a number of different sources. Number two, God can use these setbacks to develop us. So the question is, did Joseph need to be developed? Are you kidding me? Yes, he did. What didn't Joseph need to improve about himself as a 17-year-old? He was entitled. He was spoiled. He was arrogant. He was prideful. Here's what we know about leaders and life and leadership. Okay, here's what we know. You can have growth or you can have comfort, but you rarely have both at the same time, right? You don't grow when you're comfortable, and you're not comfortable when you're growing. And that's why they call them growing pains, not growing comforts, okay? Joseph was comfortable in his life. His life was cushy. I mean, his father was giving him everything he wanted, everything he needed, and more. And it's not until he's forced out of that comfortable environment that he begins to grow and develop as a human being. And you know that this is true in your life. The greatest season for growth and change in life happens when you're uncomfortable, when things haven't gone your way, when you're forced to try something else, when you're forced to trust in God because there's nothing else left to trust in. Psalm 105 says this. I'm not putting it up there. I just want you to listen. Then he sent someone to Egypt ahead of them. Who's the he? God. Then God sent someone to Egypt ahead of them. Who did he send? Joseph, right? Joseph, who was sold as a slave. They bruised his feet with fetters and placed his neck in an iron collar until the time came to fulfill his dreams. Listen to this phrase. The Lord tested Joseph's character. Every setback can be a learning experience. Thomas Edison once said, each time you fail, you eliminate another wrong option. The person that you are today, the kinder, gentler, wiser, more patient version of the 17-year-old you owe that to every one of those times that your life didn't work out and you had to start all over. You owe it to every one of those setbacks that caused you to open your eyes and take a look at your life and at you, and to determine for yourself what you need to change. So wouldn't it be better for us to embrace every opportunity for growth when we have a setback or a struggle or a failure? Now, I didn't say embrace the failure. I don't think that's what God wants us to do. But embrace the opportunity to grow through the failure. Third lesson is this. Sometimes these unexpected setbacks can reroute our lives to a destination we never would have chosen otherwise. Would Joseph ever have gone down to Egypt on his own? Of course not. Joseph would never have chosen to go to a pagan land and work for a pagan master. But that is exactly where God needed him to be, because God knew what was going to be coming years down the road. God knew that there was a famine coming. Think about your life for just a moment. How many of you met your husband or your wife because of a setback? Because of a forced change of plan in your life? I was studying to be an architect when I graduated high school, but God had other plans. So he moved me from Mississippi State to Union University. And that's where I met Marie in one of our first classes that I had there. Would that have happened if God had not led me to Union? I don't think so. How many of you have a successful business or career today because a previous job didn't work out the way that you wanted it to? You were unexpectedly let go, or the business failed or something. Maybe we should start looking at these forced changes in life plan as God's way of leading us to something better that we never would have considered on our own. And then the final lesson is this. Setbacks almost never come pain-free. I mean, when was the last time you were driving down the interstate You're making great time. The road is smooth. There's very little traffic, no potholes, no bumps. And you see a sign coming up that says detour ahead. And you go, yes, look, honey, we get to take a detour. No? You don't do that? Why not? Because you hate detours. You hate changing your plans. They're painful. They're uncomfortable. They make you feel uncertain. And sometimes when God is ready to move you to the next level, things are going to get worse before they get better, right? And you may not like that, but it doesn't make it any less true. John Maxwell says, people have uphill hopes and downhill habits. Would it change your attitude if you knew that the detour was exactly where God wanted you to be? I think it would. So if you're going through a change of plans in your life right now, and it seems like you're moving backward instead of forward, and it's painful, and you're wondering how long it's going to last, and you're thinking to yourself, I can't take it anymore. I don't know if I can handle one more day like this. I'm telling you this, hold on to hope. If you are still breathing, that just means that God is not finished with you yet. He has something for you later today. He has something for you tomorrow. Maybe God has you here in this room today to hear me speak just so you can hear this verse. Hebrews 10:23. Let us hold tightly without wavering to the hope we affirm, for God can be trusted to keep his promise. I just have a couple of questions, and we're going to wrap this up. And I want you to just take these questions with you. That's why I included them there in your outline. First question, what has God taught you through some of these setbacks that you've encountered in your life? I'll rephrase it. What is God teaching you if you're going through a setback right now? If your life is being rerouted and you are not on your original plan, what is God trying to say to you? And the second question is this. How would you think or act differently if you leveraged that setback for good in your life? What would you do differently if you knew that there was a bigger purpose behind this thing that you just went through? Well, folks, this is just the introduction to Joseph's life. And there's a lot here to unpack over the next few weeks, and we're going to do that, and we're going to learn some things about life and about Joseph. But maybe there's somebody here today who needs to hear this. God is not done with you. God has a plan. He has a greater purpose in mind for your life. He has a bigger story to tell than you can tell. God is developing you, and you are here for a reason. You're on this planet for a reason. And I'll push that a little further, and I'll say you are here at Walker Baptist Church for a reason. God has you here for a purpose. Bow with me in prayer. Lord, I want to thank you for the story of Joseph and how his life can teach us so much about what a lot of us are going through in our own lives. And so I pray right now for anyone here this morning whose life is being rerouted right now. And they've had to start over. They've had to take a step back and rethink what's happening. And it's hard for them right now. And so, Lord, I lift them up to you. And I pray that you help them through this hard time, whatever it may be. And I pray for that person who's just gone through a career change, or for those parents who are worried about an adult child. I pray for that single person who's tired of living alone.